Players versus collectors, investors versus resellers, vintage versus modern, sealed versus singles, and every grading company in an all-out free-for-all. Don't let the wholesome characters fool you, but Pokemon can be very political. And if you're not careful, you can become blinded by the same us versus them mentality that divides our world and distorts our empathy for others. Today, I invite you all to take a step back from another contentious election cycle and consider how social tribalism can threaten the stability of any community, including this one that we all share. But first, let's roll the intro. Hey everybody, what's up from Pokemon Classics, reminding you all that the classics never go out of style. Today, we're delving into another market psychology video, but this time we're exploring social tribalism. It's something we see everywhere in politics, fandoms, social media, and even here in the Pokemon community. But why do people break off into groups or tribes? In this video, we're going to investigate the psychological underpinnings of social tribalism and how it threatens the entire collectibles community. Finally, if you stick around to the end of the video, I'll offer a few key strategies to avoid the traps of tribalism. Anyway, let's dive in. First, it's important to understand what tribalism is and where it comes from. Simply put, tribalism, or the act of subdividing ourselves into groups with similarly held values or goals, is a long-standing part of human nature. Many psychologists believe that it's rooted in our evolutionary history, as our ancestors would band together to create communities for mutual survival and the preservation of a common culture. In those days, competition for resources was fierce, and often the well-being of certain groups would come at the direct expense of others. Today, these social divisions are more arbitrary with much lower stakes, but are still capable of producing an us versus them mentality that leads to scapegoating and other forms of cognitive bias. Now, on the surface, the Pokemon community seems like a relatively wholesome and cohesive community, but these in-group and out-group dynamics are far more prevalent in Pokemon than you might think. For example, consider 2020 when the Pokemon TCG was embroiled in a heated debate over the role of collectors and players in the Pokemon card market. During the height of the pandemic, Pokemon cards were quickly disappearing off the shelves with fierce competition between players, collectors, and in many cases, resellers. Everything was exploding in price, with supply and demand becoming horrifically unbalanced. This was a contentious time of fierce debate, with lifelong collectors being blamed for contributing to the hype and the hysteria. But on the other hand, seasoned players and casual fans had limited access to Pokemon products while scalping ran rampant, and so their frustrations were justified. Anyway, this created a significant dividing line in the community, contributing to an us versus them mentality of players versus collectors that still persists to some degree today, but it doesn't stop there. There are nearly limitless subdivisions and false dichotomies that exist in this trading card game space. For example, collectors can be divided into true collectors, those who never sell items from their collections, and businesses, who buy and sell cards to fund their collections or to turn a profit. Meanwhile, businesses can be further subdivided into resellers and investors depending on the time period in which they're doing their transactions, while collectors can be subdivided into modern collectors and vintage collectors. There's also how you choose to go about collecting, with sealed collectors, slabbed collectors, and even collectors that have preferred grading companies like PSA, CGC, or BGS. Despite the fact that every one of these individuals is a Pokemon fan and has at least some appreciation and emotional attachment to the cards themselves, all of these internal divisions have led to debates, scapegoating, and sometimes outright hostility. It's a classic case of hyperfixating on our differences rather than acknowledging our overwhelming similarities. But why is that? Psychology suggests 3 reasons. The first contributing factor is social validation. As human beings, we crave connection and acceptance from others, and we feel more confident and valued when we're part of a group that shares our own beliefs, interests, and values. Whether it's belonging to a political party, a sports team, fandom, or even a specific social group online, the sense of belonging gives us affirmation that we are both acknowledged and valued as part of a larger community. When we receive validation from our group, whether it's through likes, agreement, or shared experiences, it reinforces our loyalty to that group. Over time, the group becomes so infused into our identity and our self-worth that it becomes harder to question our beliefs or accurately assess other outside perspectives. That's one of the dangers of social tribalism. It inhibits our empathy for others, leading to potential disunity and scapegoating. Next, let's explore preservation of resources. This one is all about competition and protecting what we have. In any society, resources, whether they're physical, financial, or social, are often limited. In the Pokemon community, this could be anything from sales, collection items, social media views, or even personal influence. When resources are scarce or perceived to be at risk, people often band together into tribes to protect those interests. Now, the interesting thing about this is that resources aren't always scarce, and in some situations can be grown by cooperative collaboration across communities. However, the instinct to protect resources often prevails, leading to an us versus them mentality, where opposing groups are seen as threats to what we have or what we want. And that brings us to our third cause. Finally, we have to talk about threat assessment, one of the oldest instincts in human behavior. Our ancestors lived in small tribes where survival often depended on protecting the group from outside threats, whether it was a rival tribe, dangerous predators, or environmental changes. Fast forward to today, and that same instinct to assess and respond to threats still shapes how we behave socially. Today, the threat may not be as simple as a physical danger, but it can be a perceived threat to our beliefs, our group status, or our way of life. This leads to a strong defensive response, and we often become more aggressive in defending our group when we feel it's being attacked. Whether it's a heated debate on social media over who or who isn't a true collector, how to properly invest into Pokemon, or which grading company is superior to the others, our brains are wired to identify what we see as threats and to rally our tribe to push back against them. However, sometimes the threats aren't as real as we think they are. They're more about perceived challenges to our identity and our worldviews. So with these three causes, social validation, preservation of resources, and threat assessment, playing such big roles in social tribalism, it's easy to see how divisions can grow. But how can we break this cycle? One way is to start by recognizing our own group biases and how the tribalistic us versus them mentality feeds into various cognitive distortions. The first of these is egocentric bias. This is when we tend to overestimate the importance of our own perspectives, experiences, and contributions, often at the expense of others. When we belong to a group, we often think that our group's views are the most valid or important, and that our group's actions are the most ethically justifiable. For example, we might assume a reseller who buys and flips collections is motivated purely by profit and not a true collector. However, it's also possible that that reseller is using the money to fund personal collection purchases, or, as is sometimes the case with collectors out there, using those proceeds to help others. Egocentric bias leads us to dismiss outside opinions or experiences as less important because they don't align with our own group's worldview. The result? We end up in an echo chamber where only our tribe's ideas matter, reinforcing the divide between us and them. Next, let's move on to confirmation bias. This is when we actively seek out information that supports what we already believe while ignoring or dismissing anything that challenges it. When you're a part of a social tribe, confirmation bias is amplified. You look for news, opinions, and even facts that validate your group's perspective. Whether it's Pokemon investing advice or debates over which grading company is the most accurate, we naturally gravitate towards information that reinforces what we already believe. This can make it harder for us to change our minds or to even consider alternative points of view because we're constantly reinforcing the beliefs our group already holds. And thanks to social media algorithms, we're often fed more of what we already want to see, making it even harder to escape the bubble. Even if evidence is clear, we're more likely to ignore or dismiss it if it threatens our group's stance on any particular issue. Lastly, let's talk about the false consensus effect. This is the belief that everyone else thinks the same way we do, or at least that most people do. When we're in a tribe, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that our group's beliefs are the norm. We assume that because everyone around us agrees, most people must think the same way. For example, vintage collectors assuming that the mantra older, rarer, minter, better is universally embraced. Or modern collectors assuming that the masses find old Pokemon cards to be boring or outdated. This is the false consensus effect at work. Tribalism fuels this effect because it creates an environment where dissenting voices are either absent or discouraged. If all you hear are voices that agree with you, it's easy to believe that your tribe's viewpoint is not only right, but also widely accepted. But in reality, the world is far more diverse, and this assumption often leads to misunderstandings and conflict when you encounter people who don't share your beliefs. The false consensus effect makes it hard to understand why others don't see things the same way we do, which can deepen divisions between groups and fuel further conflict. So, what can we learn about social tribalism and the politics of Pokemon? Well, first, it's important to understand that Pokemon isn't a zero-sum game. It's not a situation where resources are finite, and in order for one group to gain resources, another group needs to lose an equivalent amount. It's actually the opposite. Historically, the Pokemon franchise has grown collectively and holistically. When one area of the market succeeds and grows, usually the others follow suit. Currently, Pokemon is the highest grossing media franchise of all time, and perhaps the most important reason why is its almost limitless avenues for interacting with the hobby. In many cases, there's even a symbiotic relationship between competing groups. For example, competitive play breeds events like the World Championships, which host players and collectors from across the globe. These events produce some of the most highly sought-after promo and trophy cards, which in some cases, players sell to help fund their competition expenses. On the other hand, most gaming stores use their business proceeds from buying and selling Pokemon cards to help subsidize competitive league play, giving players a social outlet in their local communities. The idea that players and collectors are in direct competition with one another is a false dichotomy and ignores the value that each brings to the other. And as someone who has collected and played the card game competitively, I can tell you that there are plenty of other people out there who appreciate both. A similar point could be made about those who collect sealed products and those who prefer singles, whether raw or slabbed. The singles collectors contribute directly to the value of sealed products by establishing demand for the cards inside. Meanwhile, those who collect sealed products contribute to the future availability of those sets by preserving products. If it wasn't for all the sealed collectors 20 plus years ago, vintage pack openings wouldn't be possible today for single collectors to experience. Even though these interests sometimes work against each other financially, they're not mutually exclusive and create a balanced and healthy market. A third and final example we could unpack is the competition between different grading companies like PSA, CGC, and BGS. Most collectors have a preference for one of these companies based on grading scale, slab design, resale value, or any number of other factors. But the truth is that each one of these companies has unique strengths, fostering competition and ultimately driving quality up and prices down. This could be a whole nother video topic, but PSA is often optimal for resale value, CGC is a front runner on grading and authenticating error cards and historical prototypes, and BGS offers transparent subgrades and the most prestigious grade in TCG collecting. Although these companies are competitors with one another, they all offer different types of value and keep each other accountable to the collectors they serve. So, as we embark on the closing weeks of this contentious election cycle, consider how social tribalism distorts our perception of others and disposes us to internal division. Whether you're a player, collector, reseller, investor, or simply a fan of Pokemon, no one is immune to the dangers of groupthink, and I'd encourage all of you to employ empathy whenever possible, because often, our differences aren't as threatening as they seem, and understanding can go a long way towards finding common ground. Anyway, guys, I welcome your thoughts down in the comments below. Otherwise, that's going to wrap it up for this episode of Market Psychology. I'm Pokemon Classics, reminding you all that the classics never go out of style. Stay well, everyone, and don't forget to have fun. That's what this is all about. We'll catch you all next time. Bye, everybody.